Have you ever looked at a watch in your drawer and wondered if the company that made it will even exist in 5 years? While the ultra-luxury market dominates your feed, some of the most famous, historic watch brands on Earth are filing for bankruptcy. From an iconic brand built by an Auschwitz survivor fighting off bankruptcy to historic Swiss giants quietly furloughing their staff, here are 12 watch brands currently running on fumes. 12. Armatron. A company that survived Auschwitz couldn't survive smartwatches. Eugen Gluck built Armatron after the camps, after a promise he made to himself about how human beings deserve to be treated. 70 years later, in December of 2025, his company filed for Chapter 11 protection, with about $36 million in liabilities sitting against roughly that much in assets. The watches weren't the problem. In 2021, Gluck bought a wearable tech accessory company called With It, betting it could ride the smartwatch wave the way it had ridden quartz decades earlier. It didn't work. Court filings describe the acquisition as failing to deliver the benefits management expected, which is corporate language for a bet that lost. And here's the part that stings. Armatron is still the official clock sponsor of the New York Yankees. Its name still sits on a scoreboard. 40,000 people look at every home game, while the company underneath it argues with lenders in a Manhattan courtroom about which of its contracts it gets to keep. Somewhere there's a kid who got an Armatron for a birthday decades ago, the kind with the digital chronograph everyone's dad wore. He has no idea the company is in bankruptcy court right now. He just knows the watch still runs. That's the quiet cruelty of a mid-price brand dying. Nobody throws it a funeral. It just stops showing up on the shelf one year, and everyone assumes it moved, not that it's gone. And it's bigger than one brand name. Gluck also owns Torgoen, its aviation-inspired pilot watch line, and for decades, it manufactured watches under license for Anne Klein, Nine West, Juicy Couture, and Vince Camuto. Every mall in America, every Macy's counter and Walmart display case has carried something this one company actually built behind the scenes. A single failed bet on wearables just put all of it through bankruptcy court at once, not because shoppers stopped buying affordable watches, but because the company chasing smartwatches forgot that was never its game to win. The irony is that the actual watch market it walked away from is fine. Global demand for quartz and mechanical watches keeps climbing every year. Armatron didn't lose to Seiko or Casio on its own turf. It lost trying to fight Apple on Apple's turf, using borrowed money it never earned back. That's one bankruptcy. The next one has been shrinking for 17 years, and almost nobody in Switzerland says the real number out loud. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. 11. Roger Dubuis. 25,000. That's how many watches a year this brand used to make. Before 2008 gutted it down to about 5,000, where it's basically stayed ever since. Roger Dubuis is a Richemont-owned manufacturer in Geneva that puts the Geneva seal on nearly everything it produces, the mark meant to signal the best watchmaking in the world. And it is beautifully made. That's not in question. What's in question is whether beautifully made is enough anymore. Before the financial crisis, the brand employed around 450 people and pulled in more than 100 million francs a year. It never got back to that scale. It settled into a smaller, quieter existence, making a few thousand watches annually for people who already know what a triple lug case is. Morgan Stanley's 2025 industry report names Roger Dubuis as one of 10 major brands whose turnover contracted by 15% or more last year. 10 brands out of the 50 biggest names in the business, all bleeding at the same rate in the same 12 months. Roger Dubuis just happens to be the one still treating its 2007 scale like a phase. Instead of a peak, it's never getting back. Here's the uncomfortable observation buried in that history. The brand didn't shrink because the watches got worse. It shrank because expressive high watchmaking only sells at scale when there are enough people bored of Rolex to go looking for something louder. When that number drops, so does everyone downstream of it. Keep that in mind. It won't be the last brand on this list, mistaking a claim for demand. The brand's answer to all this has been David Shawmut, appointed chief executive in June of 2024 after running Baume at Mercier. And his fix for 2025's 30th anniversary was a full return to Roger Dubuis's own archive designs, alongside splashier partnerships with Lamborghini and Pirelli. It's a reasonable strategy. It's also the same strategy every struggling brand reaches for first: louder collaborations instead of a wider customer base. Nobody at the top seems willing to say the quiet part, which is that the brand's entire identity was built for a world with more spare wealth chasing loud watches than currently exists. Richemont doesn't break out Roger Dubuis's individual revenue either, folding it into a specialist watchmakers division alongside far bigger names like Cartier's own watch line and Vacheron Constantin. Inside a group that large, a small manufacturer's numbers can shrink for years before anyone outside the building has to explain why. One brand quietly resized itself around a smaller world. The next one is buried inside a Swiss conglomerate's earnings report, and almost nobody clocked what happened to it. 10. Hamilton. In a filing most people will never open, one line item lost more than 15% of its business in a single year. And it belonged to a brand that used to make watches for American war pilots. Hamilton sits inside Swatch Group, tucked between Omega's headlines and Tissot's volume numbers, which is exactly why nobody noticed it was one of Morgan Stanley's 10 worst-performing major watch brands of 2025. Swatch Group doesn't break out Hamilton's individual sales publicly. It doesn't have to. The group's own numbers already tell the story. Operating profit collapsed 89% in 2025, and somewhere inside that collapse, Hamilton took one of the harder hits. That's the trap of being a heritage brand inside a giant portfolio. You get the marketing story, the khaki field campaigns, the nod to supplying watches during the Second World War. What you don't get is anyone at the top fighting for your budget once the group's flagship brand needs defending first. Would you even notice if Hamilton disappeared tomorrow? Most people wouldn't. That's not an insult to the watches. It's a description of what happens to a mid-tier name once China stops buying and the parent company has to decide which of its 16 brands gets the lifeboat seat. Hamilton spent a century building a genuinely earned story. It supplied watches to American railroads when accurate timing meant the difference between trains colliding or not, then supplied them to the U.S. military through 2 world wars. It's leaned hard on Hollywood ever since, showing up on wrists in Interstellar and Men in Black, betting that a movie placement does what a marketing department used to do. It's a clever, cheap way to stay visible. It hasn't been enough to move the sales needle inside a group whose own operating profit just fell by close to 90% in a single year. Swatch Group employs around 31,000 people across 16 brands and 50 countries, a scale so large that Hamilton's individual struggle simply disappears into rounding error on the consolidated income statement. That's not comforting. It just means nobody at head office has to answer for it directly, which is often the exact condition a struggling brand needs to actually recover, and the exact condition that lets it quietly keep sliding instead. Hamilton is fading quietly in the background. The next brand just had to admit its own books were wrong for 4 years straight. 9. Movado. The company's own accountants told investors in writing that 4 years of earnings need to be corrected. Movado Group had to restate its financial results, going back to 2021 after what it called unethical conduct inside a subsidiary branch in Dubai. Employees there had been overstating sales and booking revenue before it actually happened, making the company look healthier than it was. That's not a rounding error. That's 4 years of numbers nobody can fully trust anymore. Underneath the scandal sits a quieter problem. The Movado brand itself, the one with the museum dial sold in department stores nationwide, dropped 5 6/10% in a single quarter. Meanwhile, the company's overall revenue kept climbing, because Movado doesn't just make Movado watches, it makes and licenses watches for other names it doesn't actually own. So the parent company looks fine on paper. It's not struggling. But the name on the building, the one the whole company is named after, is quietly losing ground while somebody else's logo pays the bills. CEO Ephraim Grinberg has spent multiple earnings calls now describing a challenging retail environment and unpredictable tariff developments. Careful corporate phrasing for a business that declined to even offer full guidance for the year ahead. Meanwhile, the Dubai investigation forced the company to admit that sales had been recorded before they actually happened, inflating results that investors relied on for years. Two separate problems, one at the top of the income statement and one buried in the footnotes, and both point toward the same brand quietly losing its grip on its own name. The professional fees alone from investigating the Dubai misconduct ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, money spent cleaning up a mess instead of building anything new. Here's an observation worth sitting with. Movado isn't dying. It's becoming a landlord for other people's watches while its own name gets smaller in the rearview mirror. That's not bankruptcy. It might be worse. Bankruptcy at least admits something's wrong. Remember that. It won't be the last time on this list where a brand's paperwork tells a different story than its watches. Movado's problem is buried in a subsidiary in Dubai. The next brand's problem is being denied in a press release out of Paris. 8. Zenith. In January 2026, reports out of Switzerland claimed LVMH was preparing to sell Zenith, the manufacturer whose El Primero movement has been ticking at 36,000 vibrations an hour since 1969. LVMH denied it. Officially, nothing is for sale. But the denial isn't the real story. Zenith is one of 10 brands Morgan Stanley flagged in 2025 for a turnover contraction of 15% or more. And industry analysts have started asking a harder question in public. Can a pure watchmaking brand, one that doesn't sell jewelry or handbags alongside it, actually survive inside a conglomerate, realizing jewelry margins beat watch margins every time? Look at LVMH's own portfolio. Bulgari, Van Cleef, and Arpels sell watches as part of a bigger lifestyle story. Zenith just sells watches. When the board looks at where the money's actually coming from, a manufacturer with no jewelry counter to lean on becomes the easiest line to question, denial or not. Would LVMH actually sell a brand with a movement this historic? Probably not tomorrow. But the fact that credible people believed they might tells you everything about where Zenith sits on the priority list right now. LVMH bought Zenith back in 1999 for about $48 million, framing it at the time as proof the group was serious about owning genuine manufacturers with real movement-making capability, not just brand names glued onto outsourced parts. 27 years later, that commitment is being quietly re-examined by the same group that made it, in a market where jewelry now protects margins that pure watchmaking simply can't match anymore. Watch executives across the industry are starting to describe this same tension openly. A jewelry house sells rings and necklaces at margins a manufacturer chasing chronometer precision can only dream about. Zenith makes some of the finest movements in Switzerland. It just happens to make them inside a company that's noticing what actually pays the bills. A board doesn't need to sell a brand to punish it. It just needs to quietly redirect investment toward the divisions already proving themselves, and let the slower one keep sliding until the decision makes itself. Zenith's crisis is a rumor nobody can confirm. The next one is a birthday party that went wrong on paper while everyone was still clapping. 7. Blancpain. Blancpain spent 2025 riding alongside Omega inside Swatch Group's luxury tier. The brand collectors point to as proof the group still knows how to make something serious. Now look at the numbers underneath the party. Blancpain is another name on Morgan Stanley's list of 10 brands that lost 15% or more of its turnover in 2025. China's slowdown hit it directly. Swatch Group's own wholesale business in Greater China fell more than 30% in the first half of the year, and Blancpain sells almost entirely into exactly that kind of buyer, the collector who wants something rarer than Omega without needing Patek money to get it. The brand isn't advertising a crisis. It's still launching complications, still winning attention, still doing everything a healthy brand does in public. That should worry you more, not less. A brand in obvious trouble at least tells you where it stands. A brand quietly losing 15% while still smiling for the cameras is the one that gets cut with no warning, because nobody outside the boardroom saw it coming. We get why nobody wants to say this one out loud. Blancpain has real collectors, real history, real watchmaking behind it. It's the oldest registered watch brand still operating, and its 50 fathoms is widely credited as the watch that invented the modern dive watch category in 1953. None of that heritage shows up as a line item on a balance sheet. But real doesn't protect a brand from a spreadsheet. Omega absorbs the spotlight every time Swatch Group reports earnings, leaving Blancpain to operate almost entirely out of view. That's useful when things are going well. It's a problem when a brand needs someone at head office to notice it's losing ground before the ground is already gone. Blancpain hid its numbers behind good watches. The next brand tried to hide its numbers behind its own anniversary party, and the math still leaked out. 6. Breguet. This brand's 250th birthday should have been the best year in the company's history. Instead, it was the year the wheels came off. Breguet spent 2025 celebrating a milestone anniversary with real fanfare, unveiling the Classique subscription and winning the Grand Prix de l'Aiguille d'Or, the industry's most prestigious award, for the experimental one. Watch media covered it everywhere. By every visible measure, 2025 was Breguet's victory lap. In that same window, the brand's export units collapsed from 20,000 pieces to about 7,400 between 2023 and 2024. A drop severe enough that analysts flagged it as one of the sharpest declines of any major Swiss house. Breguet still shows up on Morgan Stanley's 2025 list of brands, down 15% or worse. Here's the part nobody wants to explain. How does a brand win the industry's top award and lose most of its production volume in the same breath? Revenue gets decided by customers who actually have to buy them. Breguet proved it could still impress the room. It didn't prove it could still fill the order book. I keep coming back to this one, honestly. It's the clearest example on this whole list of a brand mistaking critical acclaim for commercial health. Abraham Louis Breguet invented the tourbillon over 2 centuries ago, specifically to fight gravity's drag on accuracy, and that single invention still anchors the brand's entire reputation today. 250 years of that reputation bought Breguet a room full of applause in 2025. It didn't buy the brand 7,000 extra sales. The brand's most famous historical commission was a watch made for Marie Antoinette. That's the kind of history most brands would kill for. It turns out, history sells watch documentaries and museum exhibits far better than it sells the actual watch sitting in a case at retail. Breguet won a trophy while its sales collapsed underneath it. The next brand's own chief executive just walked out the door to go run its biggest rival. 5. Panerai. Jean-Marc Pontruet doesn't run Panerai anymore. He runs Breitling. That single executive move, announced in 2026, tells you more about Panerai's position than any earnings call could. When your own chief executive leaves to take the top job at a competitor, industry watchers don't read that as ambition. They read it as an exit. Panerai makes big, expensive dive watches, somewhere around 50,000 pieces a year by industry estimates, and it sits inside Richemont's specialist watchmakers division, the same division that saw revenue fall 13% for the fiscal year and watch margins compress to just 3 2/10% by the first half of fiscal 2026. Panerai is named directly among Morgan Stanley's 10 worst 2025 performers. The deeper issue is one WatchPro's own industry column keeps returning to. Panerai, like Breitling and Hublot and Tag Heuer, makes a lot of very expensive watches, but is running out of middle-class customers willing to pay 5-figure sums for them. That's not a problem a new ambassador fixes. That's an entire customer tier disappearing at once. Somewhere, a guy who bought his first Panerai Luminor in 2019 to celebrate a promotion still wears it every day. He has no idea the man who used to run the company just left for the competition. He just knows the watch still ticks fine on his wrist, which is more than the org chart can say right now. Panerai built its identity supplying oversized instruments to Italian Navy frogmen, cases so big they were meant to be read underwater in a wetsuit, not worn to dinner. That size story is now working against it. The market has spent the last several years sliding back toward 38 to 42 millimeter cases. And a brand whose whole heritage is built around going bigger has almost nowhere left to compromise without abandoning what made it Panerai in the first place. We get why the brand hasn't pivoted harder. Shrinking the case is easy to design and almost impossible to market without admitting the original idea doesn't fit the moment anymore. Panerai spent years building its name around Officine Panerai's original workshop in Florence, supplying Italian Navy commandos with instruments built to survive, being strapped to a diver in open water. That founding purpose gave the brand a story no marketing team could invent from scratch. It just doesn't answer the only question that matters now, which is whether today's buyer wants a piece of naval history on their wrist badly enough to pay 5 figures for it. Panerai lost its own CEO to a rival. The next brand lost a third of its trading volume in a year and got knocked out of a billion-franc club it held for over a decade. 4. Longines, 920 million francs. That number knocked Longines out of the billion-franc sales club for the first time in over a decade. Longines cut its own production by 18% in 2025, down to 780,000 units, and sales fell by the same 18% alongside it. That's not a brand losing customers by accident. That's a brand deliberately shrinking its own supply because it can't sell what it already makes. Strategy or panic? You decide. Here's the trap Longines is stuck in, and it explains half this entire list. Longines can't raise prices further without competing directly with Omega, its own stablemate inside Swatch Group. It can't lower prices either, because brands like Frédéric Constant have already claimed the exact bracket Longines used to own. It's squeezed on both sides by its own family, with nowhere left to move. China made it worse, because Longines built its reputation on a rising Chinese middle class, and that demand stopped showing up the way it used to. The brand that once sponsored equestrian events at the highest level, with a winged hourglass logo registered as one of the oldest trademarks still in continuous use anywhere in the world, just quietly announced it's making fewer watches than it has in over 10 years. Longines built decades of goodwill, positioning itself as the accessible, trustworthy step below Omega. That positioning is precisely what's being squeezed out of existence right now, and nobody put out a press release calling it a crisis. Rolex's own volumes dipped 2% in the same 12 months, its first back-to-back decline in over 20 years. If the biggest brand on Earth is also shrinking on purpose, that tells you the squeeze on Longines isn't really about Longines at all. It's the whole shape of the industry tightening at once. Longines shrank on purpose and called it strategy. The next 2 brands had to furlough their own staff just to survive the same year. 3. Girard-Perregaux and Ulysse Nardin. 50 people out of 320 put on short-time work through a Swiss government program because the company couldn't afford to keep paying them full wages. Sowind Group, the parent of both Girard-Perregaux and Ulysse Nardin, made that decision public in 2024, rather than quietly absorbing the hit, and the numbers underneath it explain why. 2 years earlier, there were waiting lists for Girard-Perregaux's Laureato. By the time the furloughs hit, over 900 Laureato watches sat unsold on Chrono 2-4, with models that once retailed around $14,300 trading down to roughly $8,400. That's nearly half the watch's value gone in 2 years, on a model people used to wait months just to be allowed to buy. And here's what makes this one different from everything else on the list. The people running it didn't wait around for a conglomerate to decide their fate. Patrick Pruniot, the chief executive, led a management buyout away from Kering, betting his own money that he could do more with these brands independent than a giant fashion group would ever do with them as an afterthought. It's either the bravest move on this whole list or the most desperate one. Maybe both. Ulysse Nardin's own history makes the stakes sharper. The brand built its reputation, supplying marine chronometers, accurate enough for naval fleets to navigate by, precision as a life-or-death feature, not a luxury flex. Betting that legacy on an independent buyout with no conglomerate safety net left underneath it is either the boldest thing on this entire list or the riskiest. Kering originally bought into Sowind Group back in 2008, then folded Ulysse Nardin into the same structure in 2014, chasing a foothold in serious watchmaking, the way most fashion conglomerates were at the time. Selling it back to management in 2026 is Kering admitting that foothold never turned into the sizable asset it hoped for. Canton-level Swiss authorities cover 80% of a furloughed worker's lost wages through programs built for exactly this kind of downturn. Sowind used it rather than issue layoffs outright, a choice that kept the workforce intact, but also made the slowdown a matter of public record, instead of something quietly absorbed behind closed doors. Somewhere, there's a collector who bought a Laureato in 2022, waited months for it, and watched its resale value nearly halve by the time the buyout was announced. He still loves the watch. He just doesn't mention what he paid for it anymore. Girard Perregaux and Ulysse Nardin bet on themselves. The next brand's own investors already bet against it and slashed its value in half to prove it. 2. Breitling. CVC Capital and Partners Group, the private equity firms that own Breitling, quietly wrote the company's value down to about half of what it was 3 years ago. That's the headline the Financial Times ran. The number underneath it is worse. Breitling's UK accounts, the only fully public figures available for the company, show sales falling 24% in the year to March 2025, with operating profit dropping by almost the same amount. Moody's downgraded Breitling's credit rating to B3, a score that signals high credit risk. Here's the part that makes this one sting more than a normal decline. Breitling did everything right on paper. It signed Brad Pitt, Charlize Theron, and Austin Butler as ambassadors. It became the NFL's official timepiece partner. It expanded from 56 boutiques in 2017 to more than 290 industrial loft-style stores worldwide. Average prices climbed from around 4,300 euros to over 7,200 euros in the same window. None of it moved the needle. Sales in 2025 landed around 820 million francs, down from roughly 870 million just 2 years earlier, despite everything the marketing budget bought. That's the quiet horror of this one. Breitling didn't get lazy. It didn't stop innovating. It spent aggressively on exactly the strategy every consultant would recommend, and the market didn't reward it. Georges Kern is the same executive credited with turning Breitling around after 2017, pulling it out of a genuine slump and back into the top 10 Swiss watchmakers by 2022. That resurgence is precisely why this write-down lands so hard. The brand even kept expanding through 2023 and 2025, acquiring Universal Genève and Gallet to widen its portfolio further, betting growth would simply continue. It didn't. Around 50 jobs in HR, marketing, and sustainability have already been cut at head office and in-country subsidiaries. Boutiques carry fixed rent and staffing costs, whether or not customers walk through the door, and nearly tripling that footprint in under a decade means fixed costs climbed a lot faster than the sales meant to cover them. If doing everything right isn't enough anymore, what exactly is left to try? Breitling did everything right, and still got written down by half. The last name on this list is one you've probably worn yourself. 1. Fossil. The company that used to define what a mall watch counter looked like just told its own board it's quitting smartwatches for good. Fossil's UK subsidiary filed for Chapter 15 bankruptcy protection in late 2025, part of a debt restructuring most customers never heard about because the American stores stayed open through it. The American numbers tell their own story anyway. Store footprint down more than 12% in a single year. Comparable retail sales down close to 15% in the most recent quarter. Direct-to-consumer sales falling nearly 30%. Here's the detail that should actually worry you if you own one. In its own filings, Fossil named its own flagship Fossil brand, not the licensed names it makes under contract for other companies, as one of the steepest declining lines in the entire business. The brand that gave the whole company its name is losing faster than the labels it just manufactures for someone else. The pivot away from smartwatches wasn't a strategy shift, it was surrender. Fossil spent years trying to compete with the Apple Watch on its own turf, and lost so badly that smartwatch sales fell 83% in a single reported quarter, the same year it finally admitted the category wasn't coming back for them. Fossil Group's own portfolio makes the stakes bigger than one name. It also owns Skagen, Relic, and Zodiac outright, and manufactures under license for Michael Kors, Armani Exchange, Diesel, and Tory Burch. Store count across the whole group has fallen from 220 locations to under 200 in barely a year, And even Emporio Armani, one of its licensed lines, showed up in the company's own filings among the steepest declines. When the flagship brand and its biggest license both slide at once, there's no healthy division left standing to cover for the weak one. New tariffs on imported goods didn't help either. Most of what Fossil sells is assembled overseas, and the company's own bankruptcy filing named tariff pressure as a direct hit to gross margin in 2025. A retailer already struggling to compete with smartwatches got hit with higher costs on every single unit crossing the border at the exact same time. Which one of these do you still own? Drop it below. Somewhere in a drawer, probably yours, there's a Fossil watch you got as a graduation gift or a first paycheck purchase. It still runs fine. It has no idea the company that made it just spent a year fighting off bankruptcy court on 2 continents. That's 12. Not one of them is imaginary. Not one of them needed exaggeration to make the list. None of these brands got killed by a bad watch. Every one of them got hurt by the same mistake in a different costume. Betting on scale, or China, or a rival's customer, instead of betting on the person already wearing the thing on their wrist. Watchmaking rewards patience on the workbench and punishes it everywhere else. And that gap is where every name on this list got caught. The brands still standing in 5 years won't be the ones that expanded the fastest. They'll be the ones that never forgot who actually buys a watch, and why they still want one. I have a watch from one of these brands. Do you? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe.